Are women cruel? What did Nietzsche truly discover about female nature that few dare to reveal? Behind social masks and delicately constructed roles lies a raw truth about femininity that challenges our contemporary notions. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most controversial philosophers, plunged into the depths of the female psyche and emerged with revelations that still make us uncomfortable today. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about women. This isn't about misogyny. It's about a relentless philosophical analysis that cuts through layers of illusion. What you'll discover may forever change your perception of feminine power, seduction, and survival strategies that have evolved over millennia. Dare you continue? In the theater of human interaction, women have mastered an art form that Nietzsche recognized with both admiration and wariness: the art of dissimulation. Woman is so artistic, wrote Nietzsche in his provocative work, beyond good and evil, suggesting not merely creativity, but a fundamental capacity for self-transformation that exceeds what most men can comprehend. This artistry is not merely aesthetic, it is strategic, deeply ingrained, and serves purposes beyond mere social navigation. The innocent gaze, the hesitant voice, the appearance of vulnerability, these are not simply feminine traits, but powerful instruments in a sophisticated arsenal. According to Nietzsche, women have developed these techniques not out of weakness, but from a position of instinctive intelligence. In a world historically dominated by masculine physical strength, the feminine developed alternative mechanisms of power. The mask of innocence became not just a shield, but a weapon. What makes this dissimulation particularly effective is that it often operates below the threshold of consciousness. The woman who appears helpless may not be consciously manipulating. Rather, she is expressing a biological and cultural inheritance refined over centuries of necessity. Nietzsche observed that everything in woman is a riddle, not because women are inherently mysterious beings, but because the layers of appearance and reality have become so intricately woven that distinguishing between them becomes nearly impossible, even for women themselves. This capacity for dissimulation extends beyond mere social interactions into the realm of self-perception. Women, Nietzsche suggested, believe in their own performances with a conviction that gives these performances their authentic power. The blush of modesty, the downward glance of submission, these are not merely calculated gestures but embodied expressions of a femininity that has learned to survive through adaptability rather than confrontation. Consider how this manifests in contemporary settings. The professional woman who softens her expertise with self-deprecating humor, the partner who feigns ignorance in certain domains to maintain relationship harmony, the mother who appears endlessly patient while harboring complex emotions. These are not acts of dishonesty, but sophisticated social strategies that Nietzsche would recognize as extensions of an ancient feminine wisdom. The mistake many make is to moralize this dissimulation, to judge it as deceitful rather than recognizing it as an evolutionary response. For Nietzsche, the proper response was not condemnation but comprehension. He wrote, "The great art of woman has been to dissimulate her ability." This art, refined across generations, represents not moral failing, but adaptive intelligence. What makes Nietzsche's analysis particularly striking is that he did not see this dissimulation as a sign of inferiority, but rather as evidence of a sophisticated instinct for self-preservation. Men, he observed, often operated with a blunt directness that revealed their underlying motivations. Women, by contrast, developed layer upon layer of protective coloration, making them more psychologically complex and in many ways more adaptable to changing circumstances. The power of this dissimulation lies precisely in its invisibility. Society trains itself to see feminine innocence as natural rather than cultivated, as inherent rather than learned. This misconception serves the effectiveness of feminine strategy. The woman who appears harmless slips beneath the radar of power, dynamics, operating in spaces where her influence remains undetected and therefore unchallenged. In his analysis of feminine dissimulation, Nietzsche was not simply cataloguing observations, but identifying a fundamental truth about power relations. Those who must operate without direct authority develop indirect methods of influence. The mask of innocence creates opportunities for agency in environments where direct assertion would trigger resistance. This is not manipulation in the pejorative sense, but a sophisticated form of social navigation. Modern psychology has only recently begun to catch up with Nietzsche's insights, recognizing how social powerlessness throughout history has produced alternative pathways to agency. Women developed emotional intelligence not as an inherent gender trait, but as a necessary adaptation to historical circumstances. The ability to read subtle cues, to anticipate reactions, to modulate self-presentation, these skills emerged from necessity rather than nature. What remains provocative about Nietzsche's analysis is his refusal to sentimentalize these adaptive strategies. He saw in feminine dissimulation not just an accommodation to power imbalances, but a formidable strength in its own right. The woman who appears harmless while harboring ambition, who seems compliant while pursuing her own agenda, who presents as simple while calculating complexities, she is not merely surviving, but mastering the art of indirect influence. The mask of innocence, then, is not merely deceptive covering, but a sophisticated instrument of power. In recognizing this, Nietzsche challenges both traditional misogyny that dismisses feminine complexity and contemporary feminism that sometimes hesitates to acknowledge the strategic dimensions of traditional femininity. His view suggests something more nuanced, that women have always possessed power, just not always in the forms that historical record recognizes. Nietzsche's perspective on feminine power extends far beyond mere dissimulation into what he recognized as a mastery of manipulation, a form of governance without formal authority. Man believes that woman is deep. Why? Because he can never fathom her depths. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, identifying not female incomprehensibility, but rather a sophisticated capacity to direct male behavior through indirect means. This manipulation that Nietzsche observed is not simply petty or malicious control, but rather a complex system of influence, developed in response to historical exclusion from formal power structures. Without access to thrones, parliaments, or pulpits, women developed alternative channels of influence that operated through relationship, suggestion, and emotional intelligence rather than decree or force. The whispered counsel to the king, the strategic deployment of charm in social settings, the careful management of household dynamics, these represent not trivial feminine wiles, but sophisticated political strategies developed by those denied direct authority. Nietzsche recognized that while men occupied visible positions of power, women often exercised invisible influence that shaped decisions, redirected energies, and reoriented priorities. What makes this manipulation particularly effective is its subtlety. The woman who appears to submit while subtly redirecting, who seems to acquiesce while strategically reshaping circumstances, operates with a power that remains largely unrecognized and therefore unchallenged. Her influence becomes most effective precisely when it appears least deliberate, when it manifests as natural consequence rather than calculated intervention. This governance without crowns operates through multiple channels simultaneously, through emotional attunement, Women historically developed exceptional capacity to read unspoken desires and unstated fears, allowing them to anticipate reactions and shape environments accordingly. Through strategic vulnerability, they created contexts where masculine strength found purpose and direction, often serving feminine priorities without recognizing the redirection. Nietzsche's insight was to recognize these patterns not as accidental or trivial, but as systematic and significant. He understood that formal power structures represented only one dimension of human influence, and that beneath these visible hierarchies operated more subtle currents of persuasion and redirection. The woman who could not command could nonetheless convince. She who could not demand could nonetheless direct. Modern leadership studies have only recently begun to appreciate what Nietzsche recognized over a century ago: that influence operates through multiple channels, and that emotional intelligence and relationship management represent forms of power as significant as formal authority. What women developed through necessity, contemporary organizations now actively cultivate as soft skills essential to effective leadership. The traditional feminine capacity to create harmony, to resolve conflicts without confrontation, to build consensus rather than impose will. These approaches to power have moved from the margins to the mainstream of leadership theory. Nietzsche's perspective suggests that women were not lacking in leadership capacity, but rather practicing leadership through alternative methodologies better suited to their historical circumstances. This manipulation exhibits sophistication in its attunement to timing, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to press an advantage and when to retreat. This temporal intelligence represents a dimension of power that operates below the threshold of obvious authority. The woman who knows precisely when a suggestion will be most receptive demonstrates not just psychological insight, but strategic brilliance. Nietzsche observed that female manipulation often operates through the careful management of male ego and self-perception. By allowing men to believe themselves autonomous while subtly shaping circumstances and options, women historically exercised influence without triggering resistance. The man who believes himself independently choosing often merely selects from options carefully curated by feminine influence. This indirect governance extends to the realm of cultural and moral authority. Without formal religious or legal power, women nonetheless shaped ethical standards through their role as first educators, as arbiters of social acceptance, and as guardians of relationship networks. The power to include or exclude, to approve or disapprove, gave women significant influence over behavioral norms, even when formal laws remained beyond their drafting. What disturbed many of Nietzsche's contemporaries and continues to provoke discomfort today was his refusal to moralize. These observations, he presented feminine manipulation not as devious or deceptive, but as intelligent adaptation to circumstances, as the natural development of alternative power systems when direct authority remained inaccessible. This perspective challenged both traditional views that denied feminine power and progressive views that failed to recognize its distinctive forms. Perhaps most provocatively, Nietzsche suggested that feminine manipulation often proved more effective than masculine authority precisely because of its subtlety. The command that provokes resistance accomplishes less than the suggestion that appears self-generated. The decree that triggers defiance achieves less than the redirection that feels like personal choice. In this analysis, women governed not less effectively than men, but differently and sometimes more successfully. This mastery of manipulation reveals itself in countless contemporary settings, in the diplomacy that prevents conflict, in the networking that creates opportunity, in the emotional labor that maintains relationship systems essential to both personal and professional success. These skills represent not feminine frivolity, but sophisticated systems of influence developed across generations of necessity. By recognizing manipulation not as moral failing, but as alternative power system, Nietzsche invites us to reconsider our understanding of human influence in all its dimensions. The governance without crowns that women historically practiced represents not the absence of leadership, but its expression through channels. Historical record has often failed to recognize, and traditional philosophy has frequently dismissed. Break time. Threes. In his most provocative analyses of femininity, Nietzsche ventured into territory that remains uncomfortable even today: the strategic deployment of cruelty. Women are considered deep, he wrote, in Beyond Good and Evil. Why? Because one never discovers any bottom to them. Women aren't even shallow. This statement reflects not merely misogyny, but Nietzsche's recognition of a psychological complexity that includes capacity for calculated harshness when circumstances demand. This feminine cruelty that Nietzsche observed operates not as random malice, but as precise instrument. Throughout history, women denied direct power developed alternative mechanisms of social control, including the strategic use of rejection, exclusion, and emotional punishment. The whispered rumor that destroys a reputation, the subtle exclusion from vital social circles, the calculated withdrawal of affection, these represent not merely personal vindictiveness, but sophisticated social weapons deployed when more direct. Forms of power remained inaccessible. What makes feminine cruelty particularly effective is its plausible deniability. The cutting remark disguised as concern, the undermining question presented as innocent inquiry, the social exclusion framed as unfortunate circumstance. These techniques allow for damage without accountability, for power exercise without obvious aggression. Nietzsche recognized that this indirect approach often proved more devastating than direct confrontation, precisely because it offered no clear target for counterattack. This strategic cruelty operates with particular effectiveness. In the realm of status competition, women historically developed exceptional awareness of social hierarchies and the subtle signals that establish and maintain position within them. The capacity to elevate or diminish another's standing through almost imperceptible social cues. Slight change in tone, a barely noticeable facial expression, a strategic pause, represents a form of power that operates beneath the threshold of formal authority, but with comparable impact. Nietzsche observed that this capacity for cruelty often served protective functions. In environments where direct self-defense remained unavailable or socially punished, indirect methods of boundary enforcement became essential. The woman who could not physically repel encroachment could nonetheless create powerful social consequences for those who transgressed her boundaries, establishing protection through reputation and social penalty rather than through direct force. The maternal dimension of feminine cruelty particularly interested Nietzsche. The mother who sacrifices her child's temporary comfort for long-term development, who enforces painful boundaries that serve future flourishing, who demands excellence when mediocrity would be easier. She practices a form of compassionate cruelty, essential to human development. This capacity to inflict necessary pain, to withhold comfort that would ultimately weaken, reflects not moral failure, but moral sophistication. Modern psychology has increasingly recognized what Nietzsche intuited, that feminine relational aggression represents not merely petty behavior, but complex social strategy. The capacity to assess vulnerabilities, to identify precise pressure points, to calibrate social response to maximum effect. These skills developed not accidentally, but as adaptive responses to environments where direct power remained largely inaccessible. This feminine cruelty exhibits particular sophistication in its selectivity, knowing precisely who must be disciplined and who must be spared, when severity serves purpose and when gentleness proves more effective. This discriminating application of social pressure demonstrates not random vindictiveness, but strategic intelligence. The woman who knows exactly when to deploy the cutting remark and when to offer unexpected kindness operates with a social precision that commands reluctant respect. Nietzsche's analysis suggests that while masculine cruelty often manifests as physical domination or overt humiliation, feminine cruelty historically operated through relationship systems and social networks. The capacity to isolate targets, to redirect group opinion, to orchestrate complex social consequences without direct involvement, these represent sophisticated forms of power that historical analysis has often overlooked or trivialized. What remains particularly provocative about Nietzsche's perspective is his refusal to condemn this capacity for strategic cruelty as moral failing. Rather, he presented it as necessary adaptation, as the development of alternative power systems when direct authority remained inaccessible. The woman who cultivated this capacity responded not to inherent viciousness, but to environmental necessity, developing precision tools for survival and advancement in restrictive circumstances. This strategic cruelty manifests not merely in extraordinary circumstances, but in everyday interactions. The capacity to withhold approval until higher standards are met, to create social consequences for unacceptable behavior, to establish boundaries through emotional rather than physical force. These represent not feminine pettiness, but sophisticated social engineering that shapes environments and influences behavior without formal authority. Nietzsche's perspective challenges both traditional misogyny that condemns feminine indirectness as moral failing and contemporary feminism that sometimes hesitates to acknowledge the strategic dimensions of feminine social behavior. His analysis suggests something more complex, that women have always exercised power, but often through channels that traditional philosophy failed to recognize as significant, precisely because they operated outside formal structures. The strategic deployment of cruelty serves not merely individual advancement, but collective regulation. Women historically maintained social standards through their capacity to impose meaningful consequences for transgression, to elevate or diminish status based on adherence to group norms, to create incentive systems that operated independently of formal law. This social governance represented not trivial gossip, but sophisticated community management essential to collective functioning. By recognizing the strategic dimensions of feminine cruelty, Nietzsche invites us to reconsider our understanding of power in all its manifestations. The capacity to influence through indirect means, to shape behavior through relationship rather than edict, to create consequences through social rather than physical mechanisms. These abilities represent not the absence of power, but its expression through alternative channels that may, in many circumstances, prove more effective than direct authority. In Nietzsche's most penetrating observations on female psychology, he ventured into territory that Victorian society found deeply disturbing: authentic female desire. The same emotions in man and woman are different in tempo, he wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, recognizing not inherent difference in capacity, but in expression and development. For Nietzsche, female desire operated not as mere reflection of masculine desire, but as distinct psychological phenomenon with its own logic and priorities. This feminine desire, according to Nietzsche, transcends the romantic idealizations that both traditional and progressive viewpoints often impose. The woman seeks not merely affection or security, but power, significance, and self-actualization through complex relational strategies. Her desire operates not merely in sexual dimension, but across the full spectrum of human aspiration, for influence, for meaning, for evolutionary success expressed through progeny and legacy. What makes Nietzsche's analysis particularly provocative is his suggestion that female desire often functions more pragmatically than male desire. While masculine romantic idealization frequently detaches from biological and social reality, feminine desire maintains clearer connection to evolutionary imperatives and practical considerations. The woman who evaluates potential partners not merely for romantic compatibility, but for genetic fitness, resource provision, and social positioning, demonstrates not calculation, but intelligent attunement to fundamental realities. This pragmatic dimension of feminine desire manifests in its adaptability. Nietzsche observed that women often adjusted their apparent desires to suit environmental circumstances, developing psychological flexibility that allowed them to thrive across varying social conditions. This adaptability represented not fickleness, but sophisticated survival strategy essential to navigating restrictive social systems. Nietzsche's perspective challenges both traditional views that minimize feminine desire and contemporary perspectives that simply equate it with masculine patterns. His analysis suggests something more complex, that female desire operates through distinctive channels developed in response to different evolutionary pressures and historical circumstances. This desire is neither lesser nor identical, but differently structured and expressed. The distinctiveness of feminine desire appears most clearly in its relational dimension. While masculine desire often fixates on possession and conquest, feminine desire historically developed greater attunement to relationship quality, sustainability, and social embedding. This distinction reflects not inherent nature, but adaptive response to different survival challenges across human development. In his most forward-looking reflections on femininity, Nietzsche envisioned a superior woman who transcends both traditional limitation and contemporary simplification. This figure emerges not through mere imitation of masculine patterns, but through authentic development of distinctive feminine potential. She represents not adaptation to male standards, but the fullest expression of feminine psychological complexity. This superior woman achieves self-awareness regarding her own strategic capacities. Rather than unconsciously deploying manipulation or dissimulation, she consciously cultivates and refines these abilities, transforming instinctive responses into deliberate skills. Her power operates not through denial of feminine patterns, but through their conscious mastery and deployment. What distinguishes this figure most dramatically is her capacity for intellectual honesty regarding her own nature. She acknowledges the strategic dimensions of feminine behavior without self-deception or moralistic evasion. This honesty allows her to transcend unconscious patterns and develop genuine autonomy precisely through recognition rather than denial of feminine psychological inheritance. The superior woman achieves particular distinction through her capacity to transcend resentment. Rather than directing bitterness toward masculine power systems, she develops her own sources of meaning and value. Her independence derives not from rejection of relationship, but from selective engagement based on authentic compatibility rather than necessity or convention. Nietzsche's analysis of femininity challenges us to look beyond simplistic categorizations, whether traditional limitations or contemporary idealizations, to recognize the complex psychological strategies developed through centuries of adaptation. His perspective invites neither condemnation nor sentimentalization, but clear-eyed recognition of feminine complexity in all its dimensions. The woman who emerges from Nietzsche's analysis is neither angel nor demon, but sophisticated strategist, navigating complex social environments with tools developed through generations of necessity. Her dissimulation, manipulation, strategic cruelty, and pragmatic desire represent not moral failings, but adaptive intelligence essential to survival and advancement in restrictive circumstances. By recognizing these patterns not as trivial or accidental but as significant and systematic, Nietzsche challenges us to reconsider our understanding of power in all its manifestations. The woman who cannot command, but nonetheless profoundly influences, who lacks formal authority but shapes social environments, who operates without crown but effectively governs. She represents not powerlessness, but alternative power systems that historical analysis has often failed to recognize and traditional philosophy has frequently dismissed. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you in the next video.